Hey friends, welcome back to Midweek as we close on our series titled Righteousness. And I hope that as you watch this video and you go back and maybe check out the other ones as well, that you're going to come to realize very soon that real righteousness starts from within. It comes from the heart. And what Jesus says in Matthew 5:20, which is our theme verse for the entire series, is that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. But what does that mean? See, the scribes and the Pharisees, they look good on the outside. But what Jesus says is that real transformation starts from within. And he just hits topic after topic of dealing with morality issues and issues of value. And he says, when we can get our minds right on these topics and we can do these things according to how God sees it, the fruit will pour out of our lives, meaning that people will see the goodness, the righteousness just overflowing from what's been developed on the inside. The Pharisees lost that. They didn't have that going on. And so when we can do this well, it just starts to build the fruit that comes later. And so tonight is arguably the hardest one, in my opinion, because he's talking about a concept of loving your enemies. And I just want to ask you to set the tone. How are you doing with that? And so what we're going to do is we're just going to read through it and we're going to talk about it along the way. And here's what he says. He says in verse 43 of Matthew chapter 5, he says, "You've heard it said to love your enemies, or to love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now pause there for a second. Typically when Matthew is referring back to the Old Testament, he's using this terminology of "you have heard it said." And so he's kind of highlighting that Jesus mentions this in his Sermon on the Mount. He kind of records the whole sermon. And so usually Matthew is trying to connect the dots back to the Old Testament so that we can see the prophecies being fulfilled in the person of Jesus. But here, there's an interesting statement, if you didn't catch it. It says that you have heard it said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now, wait a minute. I've scurried all through the Bible, and I've never one time found where it says to hate your enemy. Now, we see love your neighbor. We see that often, both in the Old and New Testament. But I've never seen it actually say anywhere else in Scripture that we should hate our enemies. So what is Jesus actually saying here? And I think, as I'll save you the research because I've done it, what Jesus is actually talking about is this natural instinct to just disregard someone, right? This natural instinct to be opposed of someone, to have an enemy for no reason. And these are the things that we're usually taught as a kid, right? It's the one who takes the kid to the playground and you tell them as a parent, like, hey, don't play with those kids. They're dirty, right? They're different. They have different skin color. They smell funny. And you naturally build this concept of racism, if you want to call it that, or a prejudice. And we just grow up believing that we are either better than them or we're not as good as them. And we naturally isolate to what would be a natural enemy. Because nowhere in the Bible does it say to hate your enemy. Nowhere does it say that. And so I think Jesus is hitting on something that has just been a worldview, a morality shift, even in our own culture. I mean, you could think about this for a second and find, as you think about people that you would be naturally opposed to. I mean, as a Christian, anybody that's another religion, you would just naturally be opposed to them. Why? Because our culture pulls apart. Anybody who has a different value than you is what Jesus is talking about. These are the people you would naturally pull apart. And I don't like to get too political in my sermons or in my teachings, but sometimes we have to call the spade, right? And I think more than even racism in our culture today, if I could even say this, is that there is a staunch hatred based on your political platform, right? Democrats, Republicans, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you rest on, there is this natural pull against each other, at least in our culture. And this happens everywhere through all the generations. And what Jesus is saying is he's saying, you have heard it said to love your neighbor and to hate your enemy. But what he's saying is there's this natural tone of just being opposed of someone. But he goes, I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not do what the Gentiles do the same. You, therefore, must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so what he's saying, he goes, there's really no reward for you doing good things for the people who are with you, right? If you hold the door for somebody that's your friend, or you buy a gift for somebody that you love, there's really no internal reward for that. But what happens when you treat people who you are naturally opposed to with grace and with kindness? And the other thing we have to do here is we have to define what the word love means. See, in our American language, our English language, we've contorted this idea of love into just a hodgepodge of different feelings and emotions, and it just seems absurd to draw in love on your enemy. Jesus isn't saying that you need to bring your enemy into your home, right? He's not saying that you need to go out and go above and beyond and go into debt and all this other stuff for somebody that you were naturally opposed of. What he's saying is that love needs to be an action, right? Love needs to be maybe self-sacrifice. It may have to cost you something. It's an action plan that you put in place to just be decent to the people that you're opposed to. So hold the door for your enemy, right? If you see your enemy stumble, don't celebrate in the fact that your enemy has fallen. Psalm says that, by the way, but rather help them up. And when you start doing that and people around you start to see you transform from the inside to where even your enemies seem like a friend, that's the righteousness of God. Now, the best place I could exemplify what Jesus is talking about comes from Luke chapter 10. And this is the story of the Good Samaritan, right? The Jews had a staunch hatred against the Samaritans. They did not get along. They were naturally opposed of one another. The Jews looked at them as kind of a half-breed, and the Samaritans hated the Jews, especially the ones that were in Jerusalem. They thought that they were running their politics into the ground. They thought that they worshiped the wrong way. Like everything they did was wrong. So they just naturally kind of drifted apart. They hated each other, so much so that the Jews would travel 17 miles around Samaria so that they would never have to go through Samaria. You see that in John chapter 4, where Jesus says, I have to go through. Well, he didn't have to, right? It's just natural for them to go around. That's the custom of their day. And so in Luke 10, there's a story where a Jew, he's just going about his business. He gets jumped by a few men, robbers, and they beat him half to death. They rob him of all of his resources that he has, and they leave him there to die. Now, the rest of the Jewish people, I mean, he's talking about high-paying officials, right? Religious people, experts, guys that would normally be the ones who go out of their way to be the righteous ones, right? Are the ones who are walking around this beaten Jew. This is their own people. And they see him lying and they go, well, we just don't have time for that, right? We'll hope somebody else takes care of him. I mean, where's that mentality come from? And they see this guy just broken. And it's not until a Samaritan comes by, remember, an enemy, right? They hate each other. And a Samaritan walks by, he sees this guy dang near death, and he has pity on him. And he not only takes him, picks him up, he goes to the inn, and he pays for his medical care. Now, that was sacrificial love, right? That was a love that produced action. And they put their hatred aside for a moment so that he could show kindness to somebody else. And that's the whole story of what Jesus is trying to get even then with the Good Samaritan story, is he's answering the question of the religious leader or the lawyer, right? An expert in the law. When he says, wait, what should we do? And Jesus says, you should love God with your everything, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. And the guy asked him, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus makes it a point to make sure that our neighbors are our enemies. And so as we close out this series of righteousness, I just want to challenge you to go back, listen to all the other videos, and just see the 5 or 6 lessons here that Jesus just feels like are important enough to really highlight as he's answering that question of righteousness for us, right? Are we loving people well? Are we controlling our anger? Are we controlling our lust? Are we saying the things that we do and showing up and doing the things that we do? Does our word matter? And then the concept of retaliation, which we talked about last week. And I think that loving our enemy, the people that we just naturally are opposed to, is just such a heavy challenge. And that's why Jesus kind of closes this segment with that. Because once we start doing everything else, right, we start being a people of integrity, right? We have our anger under control, all that other stuff. Loving your enemy just becomes that much easier. And so as we wrap all this stuff up, the concept of righteousness comes deep within. And I can promise you that as this righteousness unfolds in your life, it will produce fruit that will be shown to the world. And that, my friends, is how we introduce the world to Jesus. And so I hope that you'll join me on this quest of just doing better. The church could be better all the time and showing righteousness to the world. Have a great week, everyone.